Hello everyone. It is time for a new batch of historical mysteries. And tonight, the various stories I will tell you about are all stories of ghost ships. Some fictional and real ships that lost their crews and wandered on the seas by themselves for days, weeks, months, and sometimes even years or decades. So make yourself comfortable. We have a fire gently crackling in the fireplace. Everything is quiet outside, and all our worries are to be left aside for the duration of this long journey around the world and across the centuries. So let's get started with the first story about maybe the most famous of all ghost ships, the Flying Dutchman. 200 years ago, at a time when sailing ships still dominated the seas and had not been replaced yet by steamships, sailing on the oceans was still a lengthy and quite risky business. You never knew when you would arrive exactly. Ships were fragile with their wooden hull that could break. They could run aground or sink. And storms or other violent phenomena were the dread of sailors. The oceans, the seas, were still this mysterious, gigantic expanse where you could encounter all sorts of dangers, and no one knew what kind of monsters hid under the surface, in depths that had never been explored and not even sounded. So men at sea would look at the sky, at the birds, at the color of water, or at the changes of the winds, to try to anticipate and not lose their way. But in the cold waters of the Atlantic, off the coasts of South Africa, there was one sight that was said to be particularly dreaded. The appearance of an old ship from the age of sail, strangely glowing, with a ghostly light, her sails shredded, and apparently moved, shaken by ancient winds that had long stopped blowing. The Flying Dutchman. The ghost ship that announced violent storms, and maybe the impending doom of those who were unfortunate enough to see her. Repeatedly, in the 19th and 20th centuries, sailors claimed to have seen the Flying Dutchman. Authors of travel stories talked about her, so did poets and novelists, and the ship became a celebrity, a legend even. But where does it come from? What part of this is real and what is exaggerated or invented? Let's take a look at what we know. As the name Flying Dutchman indicates, this legend has roots in a particular time period, the period when the Netherlands, the Dutch Republic more precisely, was a great maritime power in the 17th century. A time period when Dutch ships sailed all the oceans of the planet. They opened new routes, and they traded all around the world, in North America, where they founded colonies like New Amsterdam, better known today as New York City, to the Caribbean, the coasts of Africa, the Indian Ocean, and as far east as China or Japan. Japan, where for a long time the Dutch had a trade monopoly. For a few decades in the 17th century, Amsterdam became the largest international trade center, and the Netherlands enjoyed a prosperity that left traces in architecture, intellectual life, scientific developments, or the arts. Just to cite a few examples, philosophers like Spinoza, painters like Rembrandt or Vermeer, and dozens of less famous artists of the 17th century were born or worked and prospered in the Netherlands. But why this age of prosperity for the Dutch? And what is the relation with the Flying Dutchman? To understand this, we need to make a bit of history. In the 16th century, the Netherlands were part of the empire of the Habsburgs, the dynasty that controlled big chunks of Europe, Spain, Austria, Hungary, parts of modern Germany and France, and most of what would one day become the states of Belgium and the Netherlands. The future Belgium and Netherlands had entered the Habsburgs' possessions because Charles V, who reigned over all of these lands, had inherited the Duchy of Burgundy, of which they were a part of or associated with. This European empire of the Habsburgs was completed by a fast-growing colonial empire overseas, especially in the Americas. Spain had established its presence there, and its American colonies in the 16th century began to produce colossal revenues. The Habsburg Empire eventually split into two branches of the family: the Habsburgs of Austria, who kept Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, which is the historical name of the modern Czech Republic, and another important family asset, the title of Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, this loose association of German states. This imperial title was elective, but for almost 300 years they did what they had to do to keep it in their hands. And these Habsburgs of Austria would stay on the throne until the 20th century. Their fall, the abdication of the last Habsburg emperor, was one of the consequences of the First World War. The second branch, the Spanish Habsburgs, was left with the global colonial empire, and in Europe with Spain. At the time, it consisted mostly of two main kingdoms, Castile and Aragon, plus the remains of the Burgundian heritage, including the Netherlands. But in the second half of the 16th century, the Netherlands were increasingly willing to get rid of the Habsburgs' rule, for various reasons. A first one was religious. Different provinces of the Netherlands had become Protestant after the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, whereas the Habsburgs were Catholic monarchs, and at the time Europe was shaken by religious conflicts. Many kings would not tolerate that their subjects adopted what they considered to be heretical beliefs. So the Protestant subjects of a Catholic king were always at risk of being bullied at best or persecuted, and vice versa. There were also economic or financial reasons. The King of Spain, Philip II, was at war constantly with other powers, the French, the English, the Ottomans, and to fund these conflicts, on top of using a lot of the gold that came from America, the crown heavily taxed its subjects and their trade. Paying hefty taxes to a distant king in Madrid that you don't like, and who doesn't like you neither, to fund a policy that doesn't benefit you, was obviously something unpleasant for the Dutch. And these political, religious, and economic factors converged to lead to a rebellion of several provinces of the Spanish Netherlands against the Crown of Spain, against Philip II. In 1568, 7 provinces formed an alliance and a new republic, officially the Republic of the Seven United Netherlands, commonly called the Dutch Republic, the predecessor state to the modern Netherlands. This secession from the Habsburgs' territory that made the delight of all the enemies of the Habsburgs, and there were many at the time, this started a long, very long war of 80 years with the Spanish. The war was not constant, it was more on and off. They didn't fight continuously. But it officially ended only 80 years later, in 1648, at the end of another conflict, the 30 Years' War. After that, Spain officially recognized the existence of an independent Dutch Republic. Now, being part of the Habsburgs' sphere of influence, when Spain was discovering America, had also left traces in the Netherlands. The most prominent explorers and conquistadors who worked for the Crown of Spain or for Portugal to explore these new lands discovered overseas were from the Iberian Peninsula, or sometimes from Italy, like Christopher Columbus. And so were most of the troops sent in the 16th century. But there were also individuals from all over Europe, especially Habsburg Europe, who were involved in Spanish expeditions and exploration initiatives. Austrian, German, Dutch. And so the experience of this new world touched people well beyond the frontiers of Spain. Especially in a part of Europe like the Netherlands that already had a maritime tradition. Another way the colonization and conquest of America impacted the rest of Europe was through the inflow of wealth, especially the mountains of gold and silver seized and then mined in Mexico and South America. When these precious metals arrived in Spain, they were spent on all sorts of goods that the relatively small Spanish economy could not provide. So it stimulated activity well beyond the frontiers of Spain. France, Italy, Germany, England also benefited economically. And being part of the Habsburg Empire, and already an industrious region since the Middle Ages, the Netherlands got significantly wealthier thanks to Spanish colonization. Actually, an economic and artistic Renaissance movement started in the Netherlands and Flanders, that were all Habsburg regions at the time, after Italy, but before any other part of Europe. So, for all these reasons, based on the criteria of the time, 16th century Netherlands was a relatively modern, outward-looking, and prosperous region. The northern part of the Spanish Netherlands had converted to the new Reformed faith, Protestantism, at least a significant portion of the population and the economic elite. Philip II did not intend to let the Dutch go and get free. So there was intense repression against their heretical inclinations and also against their will of independence after 1568. Religious animosity and repression across Europe was obviously a threat to the young Dutch Republic, but it also contributed to its prosperity, because many Protestant traders from Flanders, at the time still Spanish, found refuge to the north in the Dutch Republic, and so did other Protestants from Catholic kingdoms, where they were at risk of being mistreated or persecuted. Many also came from France, the Huguenots. Many of them, as much as they could, came with their business and their capital. With this context, in a nutshell, you have the main pillars of the Dutch surge or miracle of the late 16th and 17th century. An inflow of capital, a modern economy for the time, a connection to world exploration and maritime trade that started before independence, and also an adventurous community of sailors, explorers, and navigators willing to travel the world and get rich fast. On top of that, the Dutch Republic had quite a bit of luck too. For decades, neighboring countries that could have been threats were busy dealing with their own internal conflicts, religious infighting like in England but even more in France, external wars, especially against Spain, and all of this left the Dutch Republic relatively safe in Europe and hands-free to do what they wanted on the oceans of the world, like attacking and replacing Spanish and even more Portuguese settlements. Portugal was an ally of Spain, and the two countries even shared the same king, Philip II, for years. So that put Portugal and the Dutch technically at war too. Actually, rather than Spain, the main victim of the Dutch expansion overseas would be Portugal, which had established its own trade network to the east a century earlier, and it lost large parts of it to the Dutch. They were active in the Atlantic. They established a presence in the Caribbean or founded colonies in North America, like New Amsterdam. They also took a big role in the slave trade, transferring many enslaved Africans to the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. When this triangular trade between Europe, West Africa, and America was booming, but a lot of their attention and efforts were oriented toward the Far East. Alongside Atlantic trades like slaves, gold, and colonial crops, sugar, tobacco, dyes, cotton, an extremely lucrative trade was the spice trade, with India and the Spice Islands in what is now Indonesia. There was no Suez Canal at the time, obviously, so to get there, the strategic stop was the southern tip of Africa. Hence an intense interest of the Dutch to have a presence there, in what would become South Africa. a long-lasting Dutch cultural and human presence in South Africa comes from there. In various coastal trading posts and islands of the Indian Ocean, or in South Africa too, the Dutch just expelled the Portuguese and they replaced them. Portugal was unable to defend its trade empire at the time because the country was overstretched. Portugal was a small country with only about 2 million inhabitants, not enough to defend and develop possessions all around the world. That included Brazil in South America and dozens of trading posts and forts between Europe and the Far East, alongside thousands and thousands of miles of trade routes. At the time, the Dutch had become more aggressive, better armed, and more innovative. The Portuguese had been extraordinary sailors and pioneers in maritime exploration, but they had now lost their edge. They no longer discovered new lands and sailing techniques. For example, the Portuguese used to cross the Indian Ocean following the coastlines or jumping from island to island. The Dutch discovered a new route that was much faster, to the Spice Islands to Indonesia, a route that passed south of the Indian Ocean. This new route, the Brouwer route, used the powerful winds at the south of the Indian Ocean. So ships departed South Africa, sailing straight to the east, as if they were trying to go to Australia. And only a few hundred miles before reaching Australia, they turned north and reached Java, the main Dutch base in Indonesia. On paper, on a map, this route was not shorter than the Portuguese route, but thanks to the winds, it was way faster. Voyage time between the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa and Java was reduced in the 17th century to about 6 months, versus almost 12 months previously. In trade, you can imagine the big advantage it gives you. So the Dutch became the dominant power on the spice routes, at the expense of the Portuguese, who refocused on Brazil and keeping what remained of their African and Asian holdings, but they no longer dominated this trade. This is where we come back to the Flying Dutchman. In order to dominate this trade with the other side of the planet, the Dutch needed fast and solid ocean-going ships. There could be several kinds of intercontinental trade ships. They evolved over time. But in the 17th century, a type of vessel that was extensively employed by the Dutch was the flute, or fluit in Dutch. Flutes were initially designed in the Dutch Republic, and they had several advantages. For ocean-going ships at the time, they had the best space-to-crew ratio, meaning that they could transport a lot of goods at a competitive price, because there would not be as many sailors as on other ships. They were also relatively cheap to produce, because they were only designed for trade. A dominant type of oceanic ship in the 16th century had been the galleon, which could be converted from trade to warship and vice versa. This can be convenient in highly disputed and dangerous waters, but it also meant that these ships were heavier, more expensive to make, and less optimized for cargo. along the 17th century, a nascent trend in shipbuilding was the increased specialization of ships. Trade vessels and warships formed two increasingly different groups, and the Dutch were at the forefront of this evolution, which gave them an edge in trade. The Flying Dutchman was believed to be one of these flutes, a medium-sized, fast cargo ship designed to travel between East Asia and Europe. Now, who owned and sent away these ships? Some were owned by individual traders, but when it came to trade and colonization with East Asia or America, European countries in the 17th century used chartered companies, private businesses that received a monopoly from a state. And these companies were typically traded on a stock market. Anyone with the means could become a shareholder. The Dutch East India Company, also known as the VOC for Verenigde Ostindische Company, was a precursor and an example of such companies. The VOC was actually the first joint stock company in the world. That is to say, the first business whose shares could be bought and sold by shareholders on the market. But there would also be English and French equivalents. So the VOC received from the government of the Dutch Republic the monopoly of Dutch trade and colonization from South Africa to all of Asia. And this monopoly came with huge powers, almost the powers of a government. The company could obviously own its own ships. It could buy and sell goods, but also create and own colonies, deal with other states in its area of influence. It could go to war. It had its own private army. And this VOC organized the expansion of the Dutch Empire in Asia, from the island of Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, to Java, and all the way to Japan. For decades, the VOC operated, generating major profits for the benefits of its shareholders. The Flying Dutchman would have been a ship of the VOC, so with a captain and a crew employed by the company to trade between the Netherlands and the Spice Islands, a journey of thousands and thousands of miles that lasted several months. I told you the Flying Dutchman would have been a flute, but it would have also been an East Indiaman. East Indiaman is not a particular type of ship. It was a generic term for trade vessels that traveled from Europe to Asia. So there were East Indiamen from other countries too. But there is no record of an actual East Indiaman called the Flying Dutchman that would have sailed in the 17th century, or in the 18th century for that matter. In the second half of the 18th century, the rumor that a ghost ship had been sighted at sea, an old Dutch East Indiaman, this rumor started to spread in some ports and on some ships. The time of Dutch maritime dominance had come to an end a century earlier, and the rising naval and colonial power of the time was now the United Kingdom. So for sailors of the late 18th century, evoking a Dutch flute, an Indiaman, was reminiscent of times long gone, like when in 2024 we evoke a transatlantic liner of the early 20th century. We know of this rumor about the Flying Dutchman because it appeared in travel stories, a popular genre of books at the time. People were curious about the world, which to most of Europeans was still a mysterious place they would never see with their own eyes. In the accounts of various authors, many of them were not famous to be trustworthy. The Flying Dutchman is mentioned as a story that circulated between sailors. One in 1790 says that the ship had one day come to the Cape in South Africa in distress, and the crew of the Flying Dutchman wanted to get into harbor to be protected from a storm. But they couldn't get a pilot to conduct the ship, and so she was lost, after which, as a ghost ship, it began to reappear in very bad weather, announcing serious trouble. 5 years later, in 1795, in another travel account that told the story of a journey from Great Britain to Australia, the Flying Dutchman was mentioned again. Not to really say that it existed, but as the report of a superstition that circulated among sailors. And this account was repeated in yet another book in 1803, yet another travel story, but introducing a little variant. This time, the crew of the Flying Dutchman would have been punished for a crime. An unspecified crime, maybe piracy or revolt and the murder of their officers. For their crime, they would have been sentenced to wander on the ocean till the period of their penance expired. And apparently it was a long period, because the Flying Dutchman was still there decades after the fact. In the early 19th century, the years 1800-1810, the Flying Dutchman transitioned from travel stories to literature, essentially in the works of British and Irish authors, including Walter Scott. It was mentioned in poems, and the concept of a ghost ship seduced. It came with the rise in popularity of Gothic stories all along the 19th century. Frankenstein, vampires, abandoned castles, monsters. A ghost ship was logical in that company. In the 1820s, there was a play called The Flying Dutchman or The Phantom Ship, a nautical drama. And this play also contributed to its fame. But the biggest work that made The Flying Dutchman a celebrity was the opera by Richard Wagner, Der Fliegende Holländer, The Flying Dutchman, in 1843. And since then, with further mentions in fantasy novels or in films, like recently in the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, the Flying Dutchman became a well-known name. But a fictional name, because there was never any factual trace of a flute or any other type of ship of that name that would have got lost. The Flying Dutchman may have started as a rumor among sailors. That looks possible, maybe because someone invented that story one day and it was appealing enough to stick around. Or it could even have been invented from the start in these travel stories of the late 18th century, between authors who copied each other. This type of travel accounts are not known for their accuracy. They had begun to become more trustworthy in the late 18th century, more credible than their predecessors of past centuries. But they were still notoriously exaggerated, and for a part fictional, because their authors wanted attention and good sales. So if the public was willing to read larger-than-life, exotic stories, they were happy to provide them. But even though this ship is fictional, it doesn't mean it had no connection at all to reality, to history. As we saw before, it is a product, like an echo, of this particular period of the Dutch maritime expansion. And it is also believed that the story was inspired by an existing 17th century Dutch captain, a man called Bernard Fokke. Little is known about him, except that Fokke was real, and he appeared in multiple sources, including accounting books, the records of the period, like travel logs, the records of the Dutch VOC, the East India Company, the logs of ports. All of this makes it possible to check and estimate the magnitude of this 17th century trade, or more anecdotically, to find historical captains and ships. There was no Flying Dutchman lost at sea, but there was this captain, Bernard Fokke, who was famous for the speed of his trips to the Far East. It seems that once he completed a journey from Amsterdam to Java in a bit more than 3 months. We know it through letters that were sent from Amsterdam to Java, and they were dated and delivered in this period of time. They could have been tampered with for publicity, but still, Fokke had this reputation for extreme speed, to the point that the nickname Flying Dutchman could have suited him well. And it seems that long before the legend of the Flying Dutchman spread, there were rumors that Fokke was in league with the devil. He would have obtained these navigation skills, or that uncanny speed, by selling his soul to the devil, in a kind of Faustian pact, if you want. If you are curious about these pacts with the devil, by the way, I recently made another story about them as a legendary and literary topic. So maybe this aura of supernatural helped give birth to the Flying Dutchman legend. In any case, with its connection to the Age of Sail, to the exploration of the world, to histories of piracy that were added to the legend later, the Flying Dutchman provided a template for fictional ghost ships. But it is not alone. So now, let's leave the port of Amsterdam, the Cape in South Africa or the Spice Islands, and let's go to South America, to Chile, to discover another legendary ghost ship, the Caleuche. In the south of Chile, the coast of South America is very uneven, with many islands, fjords. From the Pacific Ocean you can see the wilderness of Patagonia and the first peaks of the Andes in the distance, at least when it is not too misty, because even though it is South America, you can forget about transparent Caribbean waters, Brazilian beaches with palm trees, or the hot weather of the Amazonian forest. Here, to the southern tip of the world, the climate is rather harsh, especially in winters. It is wet, and the vegetation reminds of Oregon or Washington or the Pacific coast of Canada. Long ago, before the Panama Canal was open, all ships that needed to travel between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans had to pass to the south of South America, to pass Cape Horn. And when they arrived in the Pacific, coming from the Atlantic, they would travel north, following this wild coastline, impatient to reach warmer and more welcoming waters. In this region of the world, there has been inhabitants for thousands of years. And there is an archipelago, a group of islands that you would barely notice looking at a map, because it follows the coastline of Chile. The main island of this archipelago is called Chiloe, and in this place the legend of the Caleuche was born. Nobody really knows when, possibly centuries ago. The Caleuche would be a sailing ship that sometimes emerges of the mist around Chiloe, an European sailing ship of the 17th or 18th century. But the name Caleuche comes from Mapudungun, the language of the native Mapuche people. Caleutun means transform, and the suffix che means people. So Caleuche could be translated as transformed people. And indeed, the crew of the Caleuche is really particular. There are various versions of this myth that are not necessarily compatible. Some say that the crew likes to party, and the appearance of the ship would always be accompanied by music, joyful voices, speaking in an undefined language. The ship and her crew would be stuck in time, in a never-ending celebration. Other versions say that the crew is not particularly ghostly or immaterial, and the sailors like to disembark in ports, especially where there are women. An old legend mentions that the crew had to deal with various shopkeepers of Chiloe, who had daughters. They would come ashore and party with the girls, and before leaving, they would fill the shops with goods as payment. This is how the quick fortune made by local traders would have been explained. They were protected by the Caleuche. But no one really knew what price they really paid for this protection, and what the cost would really be for their immortal souls. The ship is also said to be able to sail faster than any other ship, making it unreachable if it doesn't want to be caught. But the Caleuche is not necessarily a sinister ship. She also helps assist castaways, and is not known to be particularly malevolent as long as local sailors show respect. When at sea, they mustn't sing loud, scream, or act disorderly. Otherwise, the crew of the Caleuche would be annoyed and could decide to appear, or hide rocks to make the troublemakers wreck. Rather than threatening, the Caleuche is a mysterious presence that has been credited with plenty of phenomena, like unexplained wreckages, sudden arrival of the mist, weird noises that were heard at sea, or Spanish expeditions that disappeared after passing Cape Horn. And the timeline of this legend is also mysterious. It could have been an old native legend that was reshaped with an European ship when settlers arrived. It could also have been an adaptation of the Flying Dutchman legend in the 18th or the 19th century. Dutch privateers were once active in this part of the world, including an expedition that captured Chiloe for a short time in 1600. The memory of this presence could have been reactivated when the story of the Flying Dutchman reached this remote part of Chile, and the local legend would have appeared as a reaction to the legend of the Flying Dutchman. Or maybe the explanation is more trivial than that. The Caleuche could have been used as a joke or as a cover for smuggling activities, the discreet delivery of goods on beaches and small islands of the archipelago at night to avoid taxis in ports. And all this nightly discreet traffic around the island would have given birth to the legend of the Caleuche. Maybe more than others, this one is very ambivalent. The ship is sometimes presented as a benevolent entity, helping castaways or becoming a happy eternal home for the dead at sea. Other times it is more sinister. The Caleuche would attract sailors and fishermen with her music and enslave them forever to serve on board. Of course, these two coexisting visions of the ship are not compatible. In yet another version, the Caleuche is the boat of the witches of Chiloe, who use her to make unholy parties and reinforce their magical abilities. In any case, the ship remains inaccessible to the curious. It can either dive underwater, or disappear in the mist, or take the appearance of a floating tree trunk, and the crew can turn into sea lions. To divert attention, it remains a complete mystery. Ghost ships are not all fictional. There are real, abandoned ships that have remained at sea for weeks, sometimes months or even years. And here is an example of that. The SS Baychimo, spotted almost 40 years after it was abandoned in the cold waters of northern Canada. Baychimo was, and maybe still is, because there is no formal proof that she sank, even though it now looks very likely, and we'll see why. So let's say she was a cargo steamer built in 1914 in Sweden. The ship was owned by the Hudson's Bay Company, which is a well-known name in Canada, because nowadays the Hudson's Bay Company is a retailer, often referred to as the Bay or La Baie in Quebec. But the company is several centuries old, and it is actually the oldest corporation in Canada. It found its origin in colonial times, when it was set by fur traders to collect fur in and around the Hudson's Bay, this giant gulf to the north of Canada, that nowadays is surrounded by the provinces of Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba, and Nunavut. For much of its existence, the company was in the business of trading fur and supplying the small towns and trading posts and also local communities that lived around the bay. This was at the start, but the business expanded to all of Canada. So the company was by far the main buyer of the furs that were hunted by trappers and native tribes. The company followed technical progress and it transitioned from sails to steam. In the early 20th century, it was still operating its historical business. And it is the reason why it acquired the Baychimo. The ship had been built initially to serve on trading routes between Hamburg in Germany and Sweden, that is to say, on short trips. But after the First World War, she was transferred to the UK as a compensation, as war reparation. And the ship was sold to the Hudson's Bay Company. That affected her in 1921 to its fur trading business in northern Canada. The Baychimo was now to travel along the north coast on long distances, visiting trading posts, collecting fur pelts, and trading supplies, provisions with the locals. The places where she went were only accessible by sea, and not all year round. In winter the sea would freeze for several months. But for 10 years, the Baychimo successfully operated without major issues until 1931. North of Canada, many ships were trapped in the ice since the arrival of European explorers, and it is what happened to the Baychimo. In October 1931, as the weather was getting suddenly colder, and after the completion of a journey along the coast of Victoria Island, the ship was trapped in pack ice. Pack ice, that is to say, sea ice that is not attached to the shoreline. This happens regularly. Drift ice is driven together into a large mass, a pack of ice, and this may happen around the ship in very cold waters. It is not necessarily that serious. Many ships and their crews have stayed trapped for months like this, just waiting for ice to melt so they could leave the place. And ships that served in this region were prepared to this possibility. The crew of the Baychimo realized that they would not be able to keep advancing, and they thought the ship would not go anywhere now that it was trapped. So they abandoned it temporarily, because they were just half a mile away from the shore, and there was a town, a place called Barrow, where they knew they would find better shelter. They spent 2 days in this town, but when they wanted to return to their ship, the Baychimo was no longer there. She had broken free of the ice and drifted to an unknown location, with no one on board to correct her course. That was embarrassing. Where was the ship? She was sighted again a few days later, south of where she was lost, and again she had been ice-packed at this new location. Days were passing, and the winter would soon begin. The crew consisted of 37 men, too many to keep waiting until the ship could be freed. So the company sent a plane to evacuate 22 of them, and only 15 remained near the Baychimo, on the land, where they built a wooden shelter to wait for the ice to melt or to break and the ship to be retrieved. A few weeks passed, and by the end of November there was a night of blizzard, and in the morning the ship had disappeared again. It was thought to have broken up and sunk, but it was seen again a few days later, this time more than 40 miles south of where it had been lost. Once again, the Baychimo was prisoner of ice, and the crew thought that she would not survive this winter. So they retrieved the most valuable fur pelts on board to be transported by air, and the ship was willfully abandoned this time, by the end of 1931. The ship was 17 years old at this point, which was not that old for a steamship, but she was no longer new, and she had been acquired probably at a discount price. She was beginning to be outdated. Oil propulsion was fastly replacing coal and steam in the interwar period, and in particular in these cold regions, liquid fuel was way more convenient and efficient than coal. These are reasons that probably explained the lack of motivation to save the Baychimo. And so the ship was abandoned to her fate and expected to sink quickly. Except she didn't. In circumstances that are unknown, the ship finally broke free, possibly several months later, and kept floating, starting a long journey without destination along the coasts of Canada and Alaska. For months, for years, and even for decades. She was seen multiple times in the 1930s, and even boarded a couple times, but she could not be rescued and was abandoned again. This continued in the years 1950s and 60s. In 1962, she was seen drifting along the coast of the Beaufort Sea, which is the sea to the north of Alaska and the Canadian Northwest Territories. And for the last time, she was seen in 1969, 38 years after abandonment, frozen in another ice pack. After 1969, and since then, for more than 50 years now, there has been no sign of the Baychimo. She had been seen more than a dozen times in the 10 years after her abandonment, and not at all in the past 50 years, which is why the hypothesis that she sunk after 1969 sounds very likely. It would also make sense, since in 1969 the ship was 55 years old, including 38 years of drifting at sea without any maintenance. So the breaking point of the hull, in waters where she collided regularly with ice blocks, was probably long overdue at this stage. And this is how the Baychimo disappeared. But we have no proof that this ghost ship actually sank. It sounds very unlikely that she would keep floating freely somewhere without having been noticed for more than 50 years. But she could have stayed stuck in ices, covered in snow, and become invisible somewhere near Alaska or the icy shores of Canada. Our story begins on a day of December 1872 in the North Atlantic Ocean of the Azores Islands. On the horizon, the crew of a Canadian commercial ship, the Dei Gracia, saw the sails of another ship of the same kind, a brigantine, that is to say, a sailing vessel with two masts. The other ship seemed to be in a disheveled condition and adrift. So the Dei Gracia approached, and a closer observation confirmed that there was apparently no one on board. Several men from the Dei Gracia boarded the mysterious ship and observed that a lifeboat was missing. But apart from that, there were still ample provisions on board the ship. She was loaded with a cargo of denatured alcohol, that is to say, pure alcohol for industrial or medical use. And when they inspected the cabins, they saw that the crew's personal belongings were still there, some of them valuable. They also found the ship's log. The last entry was dated 10 days earlier. Like the Dei Gracia, this ship had left America bound to Genoa, Italy, and the plan was to transport this cargo of alcohol across the Atlantic, then enter the Mediterranean Sea through the Gibraltar Strait before reaching Italy. The ship's name was Mary Celeste, and this was just the beginning of a puzzling mystery. Where did the Mary Celeste come from? Her keel had been laid 12 years earlier in Nova Scotia, Canada, so she was still a relatively new ship. At the time, in the 1860s and 70s, a large part of the transatlantic trade was still done with sailing vessels. Steamships existed, but they had not yet replaced this mean of transport, which was cheaper, well-known, and still profitable. Modern shipping companies were barely forming at the time, and they had not taken over maritime trade. So a lot of independent ships and small companies ensured most of exchanges between Europe and America. The ship had been named Mary Celeste 3 years earlier and was registered in the United States, because from 1861 she had sailed under the name Amazon as a Canadian ship, working mainly in the West Indies trade. But in 1867, so 5 years before she was found by the Dei Gracia, she had been driven ashore in a storm near Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia, and was so badly damaged that her owners abandoned her as a wreck. The wreck was sold several times at a cheap price and ended as the property of an American mariner from New York, who restored it and registered the ship under a new name, Mary Celeste, as an American vessel. She was sold again, and this time was bought by a sea captain from Massachusetts, Benjamin Briggs, who had acquired a good standing in his profession and had decided to invest his savings in a ship. Briggs was experienced and perfectly capable of commanding this type of vessel. The Mary Celeste had just been refitted in New York City, and her first journey under her new name, Mary Celeste, would be this transatlantic crossing from New York City to Genoa, with this cargo of 1,700 barrels of alcohol. This was supposed to be a safe, almost routine journey on a ship that had sailed for years before it was wrecked and refitted. So much so that for her inaugural transatlantic journey under a new name and a new owner, Benjamin Briggs arranged for his wife and his daughter to travel with him. Apart from them, he had recruited a crew of 7, so there were 10 in total on board. In November 1872, the Mary Celeste left New York Harbor for a voyage that was supposed to last a few weeks, and a month later, she was found adrift and abandoned in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The loss of a ship due to the weather or attacks by pirates was not something uncommon. But these two explanations looked immediately off in that case. The Mary Celeste had not been damaged. There was a bit of disorder on the deck, in the sails, but the ship was still seaworthy, much safer than a lifeboat. And it did not make any sense to imagine that an experienced captain would have ordered the evacuation of a perfectly seaworthy ship in the middle of the ocean to board on a tiny and unstable lifeboat. Piracy did not work either, because personal belongings and the ship's cargo were still there. There was no trace of fighting, and pirates operated near coasts and islands, not in the middle of the Atlantic. Something was off, and no reason for the abandonment could be found. The Dei Gracia and the Mary Celeste were similar ships, so the captain sent some of his crew to the Mary Celeste, and the two ships sailed to Gibraltar, where he intended to have the salvage of the Mary Celeste acknowledged. This would give him a right to a substantial share of her value. An investigation and hearings took place in Gibraltar, confirming the mystery of the crew's disappearance. Months had passed, and the lifeboat had not reappeared. It never would, and the death, or at least the disappearance, of the 10 passengers and crew members was confirmed. Why would an entire crew abandon a good ship with its cargo? Several possible explanations were put forward. The first one was full play. What if the captain of the Dei Gracia was in fact responsible for murdering and stealing the ship? Or what if he had conspired with Briggs, the captain and owner of the Mary Celeste, to organize an insurance fraud? It was said that the two captains could have known each other. They both were from the American East Coast. They had the same profession and were on the same route from the US to Genoa. But this did not really resist scrutiny. First, because the Mary Celeste had sailed several days prior, and even if they were on the same route, the probability that the Dei Gracia found it adrift was really thin. There was also the ship's log that had been interrupted 10 days before the salvage. This did not fit the attack theory. And also both captains were honorably known and certainly smart enough to organize a less complicated and ambiguous fraud if they had wanted to conspire. Another theory was that the entire crew may have feared an explosion and taken refuge on the lifeboat. The cargo was alcohol, a highly explosive material, of course, and wooden barrels could let fumes escape. What if someone had lighted something on deck, like a lamp or a lighter, and provoked an explosion because of the accumulation of gas, or if the density of fumes had reached a point where it would detonate? A brief explosion would not have necessarily destroyed the ship, and it could explain some of the disorder found on board. The rope that tied the lifeboat to the ship had been cut, which indicated a quick escape. So in that case, the entire crew would have been afraid of a second, bigger explosion, and would have put a distance between them and the ship. This was not totally convincing. First, because no traces of burning were found, not fully incompatible with a brief blast due to fumes, but surprising and uncommon at least. And also Briggs knew what he was carrying, and these small explosions due to fumes detonating on ships loaded with oil or alcohol were common. They were not a structural risk. So the abandonment in a panic looked unsustainable. If the reason was not internal, it could have been external. What about natural phenomena? A bit of water was found inside at the bottom of the ship. Again, not an uncommon thing for wooden ships. There were pumps to evacuate it. So a theory was that maybe a malfunction of the pumps could have caused alarm and prompted the evacuation. A sounding rod was found on deck, out of place. They may have used the rod to sound the level of water inside the boat and be alarmed by a wrong reading, indicating a much higher level of water, which, combined with the pumps not functioning, would have been alarming indeed. That would have indicated that the ship was sinking. That's not impossible, but that would be a lot of coincidences and misjudgments on a ship which was not visibly sinking. So here again, this explanation is dubious. Other natural explanations include the possibility of a seaquake, an earthquake underwater that would have caused huge turbulences. But here again, you don't take refuge on a lifeboat in the middle of the ocean when you are on a ship that is still seaworthy. It would harm your chances of survival, not improve them. What does not help to build solid hypotheses is that a number of myths and false histories were added in the decades that followed. Newspapers retold the story with invented details. The press in the 19th century had generally little regard for the truth and accuracy, so some newspapers changed the location of the salvage, for example, to other parts of the Atlantic Ocean, like near the Cape Verde Islands. An alleged survivor spoke to the press in 1913, 41 years after the salvage. But it was a fraud, and stories of sea monsters also emerged, like a giant squid that would have plucked off all the passengers one by one and taken away the lifeboat for good measure. This was a revival of the legend of the Kraken, this giant octopus or squid that would attack ships. But as far as we know, the Kraken is a mythical creature. Other hypotheses include a moment of group hysteria, maybe due to alcohol fumes. This is something that experts discarded on an open deck. And so, without a definitive explanation, the case was closed. It was still suspicious, and the captain of the Dei Gracia was only awarded a small share of the salvage, which reflected the ongoing suspicions against him at the hearings, even though they were not proven. The Mary Celeste was finally sent to Genoa, and then she was sold at a discount price because of her bad reputation. A partnership of New York businessmen bought it, and she continued her career for 11 more years, apparently an uneventful one, and it ended in 1884, 12 years after the salvage. The current owners at the time organized an insurance fraud. They filled the Mary Celeste with a worthless cargo that was misrepresented as valuable goods on the ship's manifest, and they insured the cargo for $30,000, a small fortune at the time, equivalent to about 1 million of today's dollars. Then the ship was voluntarily wrecked near the coast of Haiti. Unfortunately for the owners, the insurance company's investigation quickly exposed the attempted fraud, and nothing was ever paid. On the contrary, the conspirators were tried for their crime. The Mary Celeste was no more, and to this day, the mystery of the loss of her crew and her salvage remains unexplained. We have reached the end of our journey in the wake of ghost ships. You can now let go and fall asleep, or pick another story from my library if you don't feel sleepy yet. I'll be back soon with another one, and in the meantime, sleep well, sweet dreams, au revoir.